The photographer arrived at 10 in the morning. This was not unusual. Album cover shoots were scheduled for mornings, when the light in a Los Angeles studio had a particular quality that photographers knew how to use and that labels had learned to trust. The studio had been booked for 3 hours. The equipment was set up, lights on stands, the backdrop in place, a chair positioned at the precise angle that the photographer had determined in advance would work. The people who were supposed to be there were there, the record label representatives, the photographer's assistant, Bill Siddons, the band's manager, who had been present at more of these sessions than he could accurately count and who understood them as one of the routine requirements of releasing an album, not creative work, not anything that demanded the same attention as the music itself, but necessary, manageable, a professional obligation of a defined and limited duration. Jim Morrison arrived at 10:15. He stood in the doorway of the studio and looked at the lights on their stands. He looked at the backdrop. He looked at the chair positioned at the precise angle. He looked at the photographer who had risen from behind his equipment to greet him. And then Jim Morrison said no. Not, "I'd prefer a different approach." Not, "Can we discuss the concept?" Not the various deflections and negotiations that the industry had learned over 4 years of working with him to expect from Jim Morrison when a professional obligation presented itself in a form he was not willing to accept without modification. Just no. A single syllable, delivered without hostility, without drama, without any of the performance that no might have been expected to contain in the mouth of one of the most theatrical figures in American rock. He said no the way a person says no when the no is simply, completely, and without further elaboration what they mean. Bill Siddons looked at him. The label representatives looked at each other. The photographer looked at his equipment. Jim Morrison had already turned from the doorway. But to understand what Jim Morrison was refusing, what the no contained and what it would have cost him to say yes, you have to understand what 1971 had become and what a woman was, and what Jim Morrison understood about both that the people in the studio that morning did not yet fully grasp. The Doors had been making records since 1967. 5 albums in 4 years, each one an attempt to do what Jim Morrison had always wanted music to do, close the distance between one interior life and another, put something true into the air and have it land in a stranger. The albums had worked commercially and in many cases artistically. They had reached people. They had changed what people felt about themselves and their world. The machinery that had grown up around the music, the image, the management, the label relationships, the scheduling of photo sessions for album covers had been the price of the reach. Jim had paid that price, not always willingly and not always without cost, but consistently. He had shown up. He had stood in front of backdrops. He had allowed himself to be positioned by photographers at precise angles and lit by lights on stands. He had done it because the music required it, in the sense that reaching people with the music required the machinery that got the music to people. The album cover was part of the machinery. He understood this. He had complied with it. By January 1971, however, something had changed in Jim Morrison's relationship to the machinery. The compliance was running out. The Paris plan was already formed. He and Pamela Courson had been talking about it for weeks. The apartment on Rue Beautreillis, the notebooks, the poems, the step back from everything that the career had become. A Woman was going to be the last album. He had not said this publicly. He had said it in various forms to the people closest to him, to Ray Manzarek obliquely, in the conversations they had been having about the direction of the band, to Pamela more directly, in the private accounting of what he was willing to continue and what he was not, to Bill Siddons, in the specific way that Bill Siddons understood things that were communicated obliquely, which was by watching what Jim did rather than what he said. What Jim did, on the morning the photographer came to the studio, was say no to the machinery in a way that was final rather than negotiable. The album cover for a Woman, as eventually released, did not feature a photograph of Jim Morrison. The artwork, a transparent sleeve through which the lyrics and credits were visible, a design that was technically innovative and commercially distinctive, was arrived at through the necessity created by Jim's refusal, by the scrambling of the people whose job it was to produce an album cover when the primary subject had declined to participate. It was, in some assessments, one of the best album cover designs the Doors ever produced. It was certainly the one that most honestly reflected what the album was, something that asked you to look threw it to the words underneath rather than at the image on the surface. Jim Morrison had not anticipated this outcome specifically. He had not refused the photo session in order to produce a better album cover. He had refused it because he was no longer willing, on the last album, to stand in front of a backdrop at a precise angle and be positioned by someone else's idea of what he should look like. The image that had been constructed around him, the lizard king, the leather, the dark hair, the stage presence reduced to a still photograph for a rectangular piece of cardboard, was not something he was willing to put on the last thing. Not because it was false exactly, the image had emerged from genuine artistic instincts and had expressed real things, but because it was finished. The performance was ending, he was going to Paris, and the last album was not going to close with a picture of the performance. Bill Siddons talked to Jim about it. Not that morning. That morning Jim had already left the studio, and the conversation was not possible. But in the days that followed, in one of the careful conversations that Bill had learned to conduct with Jim by this point in their professional relationship, which is to say conversations that did not press on the thing directly but circled it, allowed it to be present without requiring it to be addressed as a problem. Jim said, in the course of this conversation, something that Bill would return to for years afterward. He said, "I don't want the last thing people see of me before the music to be a version of me that belongs to all of it. I want them to hear it before they've decided what it looks like." Bill Siddons understood this. Not immediately. The statement had a quality that most of Jim's important statements had, the quality of arriving before the understanding, of needing time to settle into the shape of what it actually meant. But eventually Bill understood it. Jim was not refusing the photograph because he was difficult or because he was exercising artistic temperament in a situation that called for professional compliance. He was refusing it because the photograph would have been, on the last album, a claim. This is what this music is, this is the person who made it, this is the image that contains it. And Jim Morrison did not want the music contained. He wanted it to arrive at the listener before the listener had been given a version of what it was supposed to look like. Ray Manzarek heard about the refusal and understood it in the musical terms that he understood everything connected to Jim. He said in a conversation with Bill some days later, "Jim has always wanted the music to do what the music does before the image tells you what to feel. The photograph would have told you what to feel, so no photograph." John Densmore understood it differently in the context of the larger picture of what Jim was doing in early 1971, the Paris plan, the withdrawal from the machinery of the career, the progressive dismantling of everything that the image had required. The photo session refusal was not a discrete event for John. It was part of a direction of travel, the most visible single moment in a series of decisions that added up to something that John could see but could not name, that felt to him like a person arriving at the end of something and beginning, quietly and without announcement, to put it down. Robby Krieger said very little about it at the time, and has said very little about it since. This was consistent with Robby's way of understanding things, not through articulation but through feeling, through the musician's intelligence that operates below the level of words. But he said one thing in a conversation with Bill Siddons in the weeks after the session that Bill has never forgotten. He said, "Jim knew it was the last one. He didn't want to say goodbye the way we'd been saying hello." The photographer repacked his equipment and went to his next appointment. The label representatives made the necessary calls and the necessary adjustments. The album cover that eventually emerged from the absence of Jim Morrison's image was completed by people who were solving a practical problem under constraint. What they produced, by accident and necessity, was something that fit the music better than anything. Directed photograph of Jim Morrison in a studio with lights on stands and a backdrop could have produced. L.A. Woman was released on April 19, 1971. Jim Morrison flew to Paris 11 days later. He did not give interviews promoting the album. He did not do the tour that might have supported it. He went to the apartment on Rue Beautreillis and wrote in the notebooks he had carried with him, and walked the city and sat in cafes and read and looked at the Seine from the embankment, and was, for a few months, as close to simply himself as the years of the career had left it possible for him to be. He died on July 3, 1971. He was 27 years old. The album he had made while sitting on a stool in a converted rehearsal space on Santa Monica Boulevard, singing in the voice that was closest to the thing he had always been trying to say, was Already in the world, his face was not on its cover. The words were visible through the transparent sleeve, waiting to be read before anyone had been told what they were supposed to look like. That was what the No had been about, the last album, the one where the music arrived first. Bill Siddons has said in the years since that of everything he witnessed in the 4 years he managed Jim Morrison, the morning of the photo session refusal was the moment he understood most clearly what Jim had been doing all along. Not the performances, which were extraordinary and obvious, not the recordings, which were extraordinary and apparent. The morning a 27-year-old man stood in the doorway of a studio, looked at the lights on stands and the backdrop and the chair at the precise angle, and said no with a completeness that required no further elaboration. That was the moment Bill Siddons understood that Jim Morrison had always known exactly what he was doing, and that what he was doing had never, from the Venice Beach pier to the apartment on Rue Beautreillis, been about the image. It had always been about the music arriving before the image told you what to feel. The photo session was just the last time he had the opportunity to say so. What no one in the studio that morning could have known, what was not yet visible in the single syllable Jim Morrison had delivered in the doorway, was the specific thought that had produced it. Jim Morrison did not, in the general way of people making impulsive decisions, simply not feel like it. He had been carrying the thought for longer than the morning, through the weeks of the L.A. woman's sessions, and before them, through the months of understanding. That the Paris plan was not a plan but an inevitability, that the career as he had been living it had reached its natural limit, and that what remained to be done before he left was this album and then the living. The thought had a particular shape, which he had articulated to Pamela Courson in one of the late-night conversations in the Laurel Canyon house that served, by 1970, as the primary space in which Jim Morrison said the things he was actually thinking. He had said, every time there's been a photograph, the photograph has been part of what tells people who I am. And who I am according to the photographs is the performance, the leather and the hair and the look that says I am the Lizard King, and this is what that looks like. I don't want that on this one is different. I want this one to be the music before the photograph has decided what the music is. Pamela Courson understood this. She had known Jim Morrison since 1965, had been present for the construction of the image, and had watched, with the particular clarity of someone who had known him before the image existed, what the image had cost him and what it had given him, and what the balance between those two things had become by 1971. She understood that the refusal of the photograph was not a tantrum or a power struggle or any of the other categories that the music industry would eventually use to explain it. It was a decision, a final, considered, deliberate decision about how the last album should arrive in the world, without his face telling people what it meant before they had heard what it meant. The transparent sleeve that was eventually designed for L.A. woman, the sleeve through which the inner sleeve's text was visible, through which the words could be read before the packaging had been opened, was not Jim Morrison's invention. He had not proposed it. He had simply created, by his refusal, the conditions in which the people responsible for the album's presentation were forced to solve the problem of what to put on a record cover when the central figure would not be photographed. And the solution they arrived at, the transparency, the words visible through the surface rather than beneath an image, was accidentally and precisely what Jim Morrison had been describing to Pamela Courson in the Laurel Canyon house when he said, I want this one to be the music before the photograph has decided what the music is. The words were visible before the image told you what to feel. That was the album cover. The refusal had produced it. In the decades since L. Woman's release, the album has been consistently described as one of the most emotionally direct things the Doors ever recorded, stripped of some of the studio sophistication of earlier records, rougher and more blues-inflected, Jim Morrison's voice carrying a quality that listeners have described variously as rawer, more vulnerable, more present than on anything that came before. These descriptions are accurate. The Santa Monica Boulevard sessions had produced what they had produced because the conditions were different. No professional studio, Jim Morrison sitting on a stool rather than standing, the poetry close at hand. The music arrived as it arrived, carrying what it carried. And the album cover that framed this music did not show Jim Morrison's face. It showed the words through the transparency, the lyrics and the credits visible through the surface of the sleeve, available. To be read by anyone who looked, the music was inside. The face was not on the outside telling you what to expect from the music. Ray Manzarek, John Densmore, and Robby Krieger had their photographs taken. They appeared on the album's inner sleeve in a photograph that was straightforward and undramatic, three musicians in a room, the kind of image that documented without mythologizing. Jim Morrison was not in the photograph. He was not in any photograph associated with the album, by his own choosing, in the doorway of a studio on a January morning in 1971, with a single syllable that required no elaboration. The album was released, Jim flew to Paris, the notebooks filled. The Seine moved past the embankment at whatever speed it moved. The cafe on the left bank received him with the particular indifference that Paris extends to everyone, which was exactly the kind of reception he needed and had not been able to find in Los Angeles for years. He was not famous in the small apartment on Rue Beautreillis. He was simply a person in a room with a desk, working.